Kwe. This is Stephen Nojiri, and this video is in response to a couple of requests that have crossed my desk, so to speak, asking me to explain Kusunoki Ryu a little bit more. So, in order to answer this question, in order to sort of answer these questions, I will try to pace it out. And first things first, I'm going to give you a brief insight as to my interest in the Kusunoki tradition, and I'm actually going to try to I'm going to try to say the word Kusunoki tradition because it'll make sense near the end of the video why I'm going to specifically say Kusunoki tradition. So what are my reasons? Why am I interested in it? What is it? Give you some history about it. So I'm going to keep the video brief. For me, brief is, we'll see how long it actually this sound bit is. Okay, so first and foremost, you need to know. So I'm Stephen Ojiri, and so you should know my bias. Like, where is my viewpoint? Where's my bias coming from? So my bias is I am an ethnohistorian, and while I do the ethnohistory of samurai culture and shinobi no mono culture and history and politics, etc., my specialty, my specific, what I hone in on is the Southern Court loyalist, so the Nancho loyalist and the Go Nancho loyalist. So the loyalist of the 1300s and the loyalist of the 1400s and on. And furthermore, my bias. Some people know me; they know I have a Go Nancho bias myself. So I won't go into those details because I'm trying not to turn the video into a political thing. But I do have a Go Nancho bias. A pro Go Nancho bias, a support of that ideology bias. So anyway, so everything that I'm saying is coming from the perspective of an ethnohistorian who is of the Go Nancho bias and who the focus of his study is the Nancho and the Go Nancho, right? So the Southern Court and the Second Southern Court. So the Southern Court through the 1300s and the Southern Court through the 1400s and on. So this is important to know because this is why my interest in Kusunoki Ryu takes place, or in Kusunoki tradition takes place. So now you know my bias. So let me talk about my bias toward Kusunoki traditions. So the Kusunoki traditions, I now view the Kusunoki tradition as a sacred thing. When I started, it was a respected thing, but at this point I both respect it and consider it a sacred thing. On top of my considering it respectful and sacred, the reason that I bothered with Kusunoki traditions in the first place is because while the Southern Court, the Southern Court and the Second Southern Court has multiple traditions of tactics, the Kusunoki tradition is the premier system of tactics, and it's pretty much the main system in the 1300s, and it's pretty much also the main system in the Second Southern Court, the Go Nancho, through the 1400s into the 1500s and on. So while you can have Southern Court loyalists without Kusunoki tradition, in theory, almost always when you see Southern Court or Second Southern Court tradition, almost always there is the Kusunoki tradition as well, to some level. So one cannot be of the Go Nancho bias. One cannot be a researcher of this religious political movement ideology. One cannot participate or study it, etc., 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 without having good knowledge of the Kusunoki tradition. So this is my bias. This is my reason for pursuing Kusunoki tradition, and this is ultimately part of the history, or part of the Kusunoki tradition, is this interwovenness with the Southern Court. So what is Kusunoki? Oh, so now the Kusunoki tradition. What is the Kusunoki tradition? You have three waves, three major points in the tradition history that you can clock so to speak. The first wave is Kusunoki Masashige and his son Masatora and Masanori. So Kusunoki Masashige and his two sons. This is the first wave. The second wave is Kusunoki Masahide and his sons in the 1400s. And there's some debate there. So in the second half of the 1500s, there is Kusunoki Masatora. There's some debate on whether Masatora represents the end of the second wave or the beginning of the third wave. I definitely believe he represents the end of the second wave. So I would say that the second wave really begins with Kusunoki Masakatsu and reaches its pinnacle with Kusunoki Masahide and his sons, but ends with Kusunoki Masatora. So it's about 100-year period we see here, give or take, of the second wave. So the first wave is basically the 1300s. The second wave is basically the 1400s into the 1500s. Then at the beginning of the 1600s, we have the third wave come about. Again, like I said, there's some researchers that put Masatora into the beginning of the third wave. But based on Masatora's teachings himself, he clearly should be placed with at the end of the second wave. So the very clearly, in my opinion, the third wave begins in the 1600s. Technically past Masatora's life or Masatora's time into like Masatora's grandchildren, like son and grandson that time. Now, so the third wave is composed of schools. Now remember, I've been trying hard to say Kusunoki tradition because for the first wave and the second wave, it wasn't a school, it was a tradition. And there are splinter traditions where, for example, members of the certain families, certain loyal Southern Court loyalist families, ended up creating their own family traditions based off the Kusunoki tradition. But in terms of actual schools, like a public building that you could pay money to attend the classes, that started in the 1600s. And there are three main schools. One school is located in Western Honshu, Kyushu area, and that school is based mostly off of the Taiheki commentaries, which I discussed in my Gunsho video. I'm not going to go over it again here, but in my Gunsho video, I explained what a Hyoban is. So there's the Taiheki Hyobans, and the school in Western Japan, like Kyushu, really focuses on the Taiheki Hyobans. It is actually a monk from the Lotus sect actually starts this school. And it's, like I said, it revolves around the Taiheki Hyobans, but he also has some other Kusunoki teachings, some, not much, but some that he got. So he pretty much starts this tradition out in Kyushu. It has a couple of different names throughout history. It's sort of referred to as different names. And it's kind of got a couple of different names because it's not exactly a school that you can attend. He goes around and he gives private lectures. So you pay him to come and lecture, so to speak. Then you have in Eastern Honshu, like when you get around like Aizu, that area, right? Or, the like the Fukushima, Tokyo, et cetera, that part. Mutsu province, that side of Honshu. You have a tradition that is based off of several documents and some of those. Remember, I mentioned earlier, there's some of those branch traditions that came off in the later 1400s. So they sort of spawn a Kusunoki school off in the eastern part of Honshu. The pinnacle system, though, the system that really embodies the Kusunoki tradition the most, though, And again, when I say school, I mean an actual organization that you can pay money and receive teachings, like a school, a proper school by proper name. That would be Kusunoki Ryugungaku, also known as Nankiryu, uh, also sometimes referred to as Nanboku. There's some debate on whether it should be pronounced Nanboku or Nanki, but pretty much it's clocked in that it should be pronounced Nankiryu. Anyway, that school, that's your big school in the 1600s. That is the tradition of Kusunoki Fuden and his student Yui Shosetsu. That school is it has satellites located all around the country. It's got a main center in Nagoya. It's got a main center in Osaka, one in Tokyo, and one out in I think Okayama, and then also in somewhere in Kyushu, northern Kyushu. And those are sort of hubs, and then Fuden sort of travels around to these different places. And then when Yui Shosetsu takes over the school, because Yui Shosetsu inherits the school from Fuden, and then he travels around. His main locations are Osaka, Wakayama, the Osaka area, which also like Wakayama, so the Kishu Tokugawa as well. We know Tokugawa Yorinobu, for example. So we have Yui Shosetsu going around in the Osaka, Wakayama area and the Owari or the Nagoya area. And again, there's also branch centers in other places, but it's basically central Honshu is where that school is taking place. So that's the Kusunoki Ryugungaku. That is the quote unquote main Kusunoki school. Now, again, I need to be very clear. These are institutions. When I say school, I mean institution. Like there's a building, there's a headmaster, you have to pass tests, you get certificates, things like that. This is still not the main tradition. So the Kusunoki main line, which would be like Masashige, Matsuura, Matsunori, Masakatsu, Masahide, all the way down to Masatora, Masatatsu, etc., the main line, which is also hand in hand with the Southern Court Loyalists, right? That line, that never opens a school. But like I said, Kusunoki Fuden, who's a Kusunoki relative, right? So he's part of the Kusunoki family. He's not a direct descendant of Kusunoki Masashige. He's related, but he's not the main direct descendant. So he creates the Kusunoki Ryugungaku institution where you could actually pay money and join and take classes and get certificates. So it's very, very important that you distinguish between a school as an institution and a family tradition. It's very important. So you should understand that at this point, there are 4 Kusunoki schools, there are 3 institutions, and there's 1 tradition. The main line is still a tradition, and then you have 3 institutions. 2 of the institutions are built off of periphery teachings, and one of the institutions, the Kusunoki Ryugungaku, is based off of Kusunoki Fuden, which is a Kusunoki family member. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense, and you guys can keep that all in order. The Kusunoki school was doing very well, but if any of you guys know your Edo period history, you know that Yui Shosetsu leads an unsuccessful rebellion in the 1650s, and that basically causes the school to have to close. The school isn't particularly ordered to be closed, but it's enough bad publicity that the school has to close. And what happens then is a lot of the instructors from the school, people that were certified instructors, basically go out on their own and become private individual tutors. And at this point, you find they start writing openly about Kusunoki. So you start finding a lot of text about Kusunoki traditions being published between 1650 and 1690. because their job as an instructor at the school was finished, so now they had to sell material, and they not only to make money but to also get people to read the material and then invite them for lectures. And so at the same and it's basically at this point the you also started to see the crumbling or the slowing down of the other Kusunoki schools, even though they weren't related to Yui Shosetsu. Unfortunately, like it left the failed rebellion sort of just put a damper on all Kusunoki things, and so um, pretty much the system that was out in the schools, the systems themselves start to really slow down. And what you get is you get a whole bunch of individual people that were, like I said, certified instructors, and they now sort of wander the country as lecturers, or they get hired in a particular domain as a historian. There's one guy, for example, his name is Inami, and he basically gets hired out in the Aizu domain to lecture on the Taiheki commentaries and on Kusunoki tactics, etc., etc., etc. So even though the schools fade out after 1650 because of the failed rebellion, the schools fade out. Even not just the main school, but the other schools also sort of take social political hit. They all sort of just fade out at that point, and they become a series of individuals sort of wandering the country, giving lectures, publishing manuals, books, etc., etc., etc. The main line, though, the actual main line of Kusunoki continues on just fine. And the Southern Court loyalists continue on. So even though the institutions formed in the early 1600s eventually collapse, the Kusunoki tradition, the main line, and the main line of the Kusunoki family continues. The Southern Court loyalists continue, and the Kusunoki tradition continues as well. So that is a very, very simplified and very brief. Now, please understand that was a very simplified and extremely brief look at the history of Kusunoki tradition. Three waves: the original wave, the sort of revitalization in the 1400s, and then the emergence of institutions in the 1600s. Three distinct waves. Each one of these waves has its own set of documents. You have the original writings of Kusunoki and his sons. You have the writing, and those writings then go into the 1400s, where his descendants like Masahide, et cetera, and his sons add to those. And then in the 1600s, when the institutions come around, they write up their own documents. So you have three distinct waves of documents, and you can tell very clearly which wave, which generation, so to speak, the document comes from. Obviously, the first wave, Kusunoki, Masashige, and his sons, have the least amount of documentation. There are a lot of documents produced in the 1600s by the institutions that give credit to Masashige out of deference, but it's obvious Masashige didn't write that document. The documents that Masashige and his sons wrote, there's very few of them. Very few. It's a really small collection of documents, but they're crucial and important because the very essence of the Kusunoki tradition is found in those couple of documents. And then the second and third wave basically just adds to it, adds to it, adds to it. Like there may be a diagram in the first wave, and then in the second wave, they add some commentary and they add a few parts to the diagram. And then in the third wave, they add more commentary and add more parts to the diagram. You can watch the diagrams get more complex over the different waves. And you can know what wave a document comes from based on the complexity of what's included in the diagram. Different traditions. Remember how I said you have the main line tradition, but you have some branches, and you also have the three different institutions. Well, each of the three institutions had their own take on the second and first wave. So the school out in Kyushu didn't explain things exactly the same that the Kusunoki Ryu Gungaku of Kusunoki Fuden explained it. Nor did the Aizu sort of school corroborate as well. So you do actually see definitive differences in the third wave documents. First wave documents, they all jive. They jive. The second wave documents jive with the first wave and with themselves. First and second waves jive perfectly. The third wave, you start to run into conflicting explanations because these different institutions believe and view things differently. Now, if you wanted to say which one of these three institutions is the closest to the actual Kusunoki family tradition, it would be Kusunoki Fuden School, that main one out of the Owari and Waka, the Kusunoki Ryugungaku from of Kusunoki Fuden. That would be the one that is the closest to the actual Kusunoki family tradition. For example, the Western school, based off the Taiheki commentaries, say that the warfare gives rise to the need for Buddhism. But the Kusunoki Ryugungaku says that Buddhism is the original source, and that the true heiho, true tactics, are a branch of the enlightened general. So one branch says so again, the Western branch says that Buddhism is a means to an end, so to speak, and the Kusunoki Ryugungaku of Kusunoki Fuden says that Buddhism is the origin of the tactics. So like there's a bunch of little details back and forth that they don't share. But again, out of all of the institutions, Kusunoki Fuden's institution matches the Kusunoki family tradition the closest. It doesn't match it perfectly, but it matches it the closest. So then now let's look for just a moment at what is Kusunoki tradition. Simply put, the Kusunoki tradition is religion, politics, guerrilla warfare, fortification, and sieging of fortification. And that's it. All combat, sword, spear, horse, archery, is not taught in the Kusunoki tradition. It's presumed that you're learning that somewhere else. It's just not covered. If you're a warrior in the 13, 14, 15, it's just understood that you're going to know those things. There's no reason to like really teach it to you. You're going to have it. It doesn't teach it. It focuses on, again, guys, you have to hear me when I say this. Kusunoki tradition, being a Southern court loyalist tradition, is extremely, extremely heavy on the religion and the politics. Because the idea is that if the religion, the politics are correct in your mind, then you will be clever without having to be taught how to be clever. So there is a immense amount of religion and politics, followed by small unit tactics. Now, when I say small unit, I mean like 500 people. There's a couple of teachings that discuss 1,000 plus, but for the most part, all the tactics are for 500 or less warriors. Small units. So 500 is a small unit in comparison to like an army of thousands. So it can range anywhere from a 500 man unit to a 25 man group. Okay, so we're talking small small guerrilla tactics. And when I say guerrilla tactics, I mean guerrilla tactics. The ideology of Kusunoki Ryu is this. Now pay close attention because here you go. Here is the ideology of the tactics for Kusunoki Ryu. You have a large force and a small force. The only way that the large force can lose to the small force is if the small force can isolate little pieces of the large force and chop them off piece by piece. There, that's it, done. So there you go. There's your Kusunoki lesson for the day. You have to, if you are, it is the teaching for a small. It's a teaching for how 500 warriors can defeat an army of 10,000 soldiers. And it's not about how you can magically just destroy 10,000 soldiers. It's a guerrilla warfare system of slicing and dicing the enemy into small chunks to take them out piece by piece by piece, cutting your way to the vital points. You would not in the Kusunoki tradition, you are not taught to attack 10,000 people with 500 people. You're taught to lure away a couple hundred people, defeat them. Lure away a couple hundred people, defeat them. Lure away a couple hundred people, defeat them. Make a have some kind of conspiracy to cause that leader to leave. All right, so now 1,000 guys just left, just abandoned the army. You break the army down until it is manageable parts, and then you find the weak points and you attack the weak points. But you have to weaken the army to expose the weak points, and then you hit the weak points. That is the Kusunoki tactics in a nutshell. It is small group warfare, guerrilla warfare, 500 or less soldiers and warriors in your group. Like I said, it's predominantly religion and it's predominantly politics, and then you get into those guerrilla tactics, and then there's some fortification building and some fortification defending fortification building and defending, and then sieging fortifications. These come in as well. Um, Even though Kusunoki Masashige is most known for his sieges and his defenses, the actual Kusunoki tradition has the least amount is about sieging and defending. Mostly it's politics and religion, followed by guerrilla tactics, and then you have some larger unit tactics, then you have some sieging and defending tactics. Now that's the first and second wave. And then when you hit the third wave where the institutions begin to add a lot more to it because they have institutions, they're going to need a larger syllabus so that they can teach students and hand out diplomas and certificates and stuff. So they start adding lots more to it, lots more to it. But also, to be fair, the inclusion of firearms in the late 1500s requires that there is an entire edition involving firearms. Kusunoki Masatora actually is the first person to address the firearm issue. There's a text that he wrote that basically is, and this is why it's difficult because because he discusses firearms. Some researchers want to put him into that third wave, but he is Kusunoki direct bloodline, and which puts him in the Kusunoki family tradition, not the institution, but the family tradition. But also, even though he's introducing like firearms and tactics for firearms, he's still writing in a way that's extremely reminiscent to his ancestors, Masahide, and Masashige, and Masanori, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the three institutions write very, very specific to their own style. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. If you guys have any questions, please either leave them, contact me and ask me, or go ahead and leave them the questions somewhere in the comments, et cetera, et cetera. And that's that. So what we've looked, again, I've explained who I am and what my biases are. I've given you, it's been 30 minutes, and even though it's been 30 minutes, I've left a lot out. I've really cut to the core. I have tried to give you a reasonable overview of the history and the basics, but at the same time, I am fully aware that I have left 97% of everything out. So Again, forgive me for being so rude as to only give you just a sliver of this history. But again, I've been talking for 30 minutes and I've only given you a sliver. So there's so much to cover, but at the same time, I feel like I've given you enough for you to have at least a reasonable idea of a basic concept of what is the Kusunoki tradition. So try to remember these points. If you need to, go back and write the points down. Don't confuse things. Remember the difference between Kusunoki tradition and the institutions that were opened in the 1600s. Understand that there's three distinct waves, and understand that Kusunoki Ryu is religion, politics, guerrilla warfare, a little bit of large tactics, and a little bit of castle defending and sieging. And like I said, if you have any further questions, if you feel some kind of karmic connection to Kusunoki Ryu, compelled to know more, then go ahead and contact me. Again, I said it earlier in the video, I have a Southern Court bias, and I also hold the Kusunoki teachings to be sacred. So understand that on one hand, while I approach it from a ethno-historian perspective, I do have those two biases. So remember that if you contact me. Okay, thank you for listening. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.